They don't say it to your face, but you can feel it, can't you? The silence when you walk in, the looks that linger just a second too long, the way they smile, but it never reaches their eyes. You tried, didn't you? Tried to fit their mold, tried to play by their rules, tried to be what they could understand. But no matter how much you adjusted yourself, something about you kept slipping through their fingers. Something they couldn't define. And that's what made them uncomfortable. Because people don't hate what they understand. They hate what they can't control. You don't think like them. You don't move like them. You don't beg for approval the way they were taught to. And that breaks the silent agreement everyone else is following. The one where you shrink yourself just enough to be accepted. But you didn't shrink, and now your existence feels like a threat to them. You were never designed to fit their mold, no matter how many times they tried to press you into it. From the beginning, there was always something about you that didn't quite align with what they expected. Maybe it was the way you thought, questioning things they blindly accepted. Maybe it was the way you carried yourself, refusing to shrink just to make others comfortable. Or maybe it was something deeper, something even you couldn't fully explain, but they could always sense it. They noticed it early, the subtle resistance, the way you didn't nod along just to belong. At first, they tried to correct you, to guide you back into what they considered normal. They told you to adjust, to be more like everyone else, to follow the pattern that had already been laid out. And for a moment, maybe you considered it. Maybe you even tried. You watched how they spoke, how they acted, how they blended into each other so effortlessly, and you wondered if you were the problem. But every time you tried to force yourself into that mold, something inside you pushed back. It felt unnatural, like wearing a mask that didn't quite fit your face. You could imitate them, sure. You could play the role for a while, but it drained you. It stripped away something real, something raw, something that made you who you are. And deep down, you knew that if you kept going like that, you wouldn't just be accepted, you'd be erased. That's the part they never understood. For them, fitting in was survival. It was safety. They built their identities around approval, around being validated by the group. So when they saw you stepping outside of that, not begging for permission, not bending to the same pressures, it confused them. And confusion has a funny way of turning into discomfort. Discomfort turns into judgment, and judgment, if left unchecked, turns into resentment. Because your refusal wasn't just about you. It quietly challenged everything they had chosen to become. Your existence raised questions they didn't want to answer. If you could live without their approval, then what did that say about their dependence on it? If you could stand alone, then what did that say about the compromises they made just to stay accepted? So they started labeling you difficult, different, arrogant, strange. It was easier to put you in a box than to admit that you simply didn't belong in theirs. They needed those labels, not because they defined you, but because they protected them. Labels gave them the illusion of understanding, the comfort of control. But the truth is, you never refused their mold out of rebellion for the sake of rebellion. You refused it because it didn't fit, because something in you recognized that living a borrowed identity wasn't living at all. You saw through the script they were all following, the invisible rules that kept everyone predictable, manageable, easy to define, and you couldn't unsee it. That's what separates you. Not superiority, not defiance, just awareness. An awareness that once it settles in, doesn't let you go back to pretending. You stopped trying to be a version of yourself that made others comfortable. And in doing so, you became something they couldn't easily read, couldn't easily influence, couldn't easily control. They don't say it out loud, but they feel it every time you make a decision without asking for permission. There's something about the way you move, like you're not waiting for a signal, not looking around to see who approves, not adjusting your path to match theirs. It unsettles them, not because you're loud about it, but because you're not. Your independence doesn't need to announce itself. It just exists, quiet and undeniable. Most people are trained to look outward before they act. They measure their choices against expectations, weigh their moves against reactions, calculate how much acceptance they might gain or lose. It's a system they've learned to trust, even if it slowly chips away at who they are. But you stepped outside of that system. You stopped asking the room how to live your life. And the moment you did that, you became unpredictable. Unpredictability makes people nervous. It breaks their sense of order. They can't map you out, can't anticipate your reactions, can't place you into the neat categories they use to make sense of the world. And when they can't predict you, they can't control you. That's where the discomfort begins to grow. It's not really about you doing anything wrong. In fact, that's what bothers them the most. You're not causing chaos. You're not trying to disrupt them. You're simply existing on your own terms. And somehow, that feels like a silent challenge to everything they've accepted as normal. Because your independence reflects something back at them. It forces them to notice the ways they've been dependent on validation, dependent on approval, dependent on fitting into a structure they never questioned. And that reflection isn't flattering. It exposes the compromises they've made, the parts of themselves they've hidden just to stay accepted. So they start interpreting your independence as arrogance. It's easier that way. If they can convince themselves that you think you're better than them. They don't have to confront the possibility that you're simply freer than them. They twist your self-direction into something negative, something they can criticize, something that allows them to feel justified in their discomfort. They watch you make choices without hesitation, and instead of seeing confidence, they see defiance. They see someone who isn't playing by the same invisible rules. And when you don't follow those rules, it makes the rules themselves look weaker, less absolute, less necessary. That's not something they're ready to accept. Your independence becomes a mirror they can't avoid. Every time you walk your own path, it reminds them that they could have done the same, that they still could. But choosing that path would mean facing uncertainty, risking rejection, stepping away from the safety they've built around themselves. And most people would rather resent someone who is free than confront their own fear of being free. So the tension builds. Not because you're attacking them, but because your existence quietly questions their choices. They start to pull away, to judge, to criticize, to create distance, not out of strength, but out of discomfort, because being around someone who doesn't need the same approval they depend on makes them feel exposed. And the more you continue to stand on your own, the more that discomfort grows into something sharper, something heavier, something they don't always understand, but they feel it every time they realize that you're not waiting for them to tell you who to be. They like things they can explain, things they can predict, label, and place neatly into categories that make them feel in control. It gives them comfort, this illusion that everything around them follows a pattern, that people are simple once you understand the rules. Most of them spend their lives learning those rules, memorizing behaviors, reading reactions, adjusting themselves just enough to stay within what's acceptable. It's a system that rewards predictability, and they've become very good at playing along. And then there's you. You don't follow the script the way they expect. You don't react the way they've learned to anticipate. Sometimes you stay quiet when they're waiting for a reaction. Sometimes you speak when they assume you'll stay silent. Your decisions don't always align with what makes sense to them, and that's where the tension begins. Because the moment they can't predict you, they lose their sense of control. Control doesn't always look obvious. It's not always loud or forceful. Most of the time, it's subtle. It's in the way people expect certain responses, the way they rely on patterns to navigate relationships, the way they feel secure when they know how someone will behave. When those patterns hold, everything feels stable. But when someone like you steps outside of that, it disrupts the balance they depend on. They start trying to figure you out. At first, it's curiosity. They watch you closely, trying to decode your behavior, trying to find a pattern they can rely on. They ask questions, not always directly, but in the way they observe, in the way they test boundaries, in the way they subtly push to see how you'll respond. They're searching for something familiar, something they can recognize and categorize. But the more they look, the less they understand. And that's when curiosity begins to turn into discomfort. Because what they can't understand, they can't control. And what they can't control, they start to see as a problem, not because it actually is one, but because it doesn't fit into the structure they rely on to feel secure. You become unpredictable in a way that unsettles them. Not chaotic, not irrational, just outside of their expectations. That's when the labels start to appear. They call you confusing, inconsistent, complicated. They try to reduce you to something simpler, something easier to manage, but none of the labels quite stick. You don't behave in a way that allows them to fully define you, and that frustrates them more than they're willing to admit. So they shift from trying to understand you to trying to influence you. Subtle suggestions, quiet pressure, little comments meant to guide you back into something more familiar, more predictable. They don't always realize they're doing it. It's instinct. A way of restoring the balance they've lost. If they can get you to behave like everyone else, then everything makes sense again. But you don't adjust. Or at least, not in the way they expect. And every time you choose your own response instead of the one they anticipated, it reinforces the same uncomfortable truth. You're not operating under their rules. That's what makes it difficult for them. It's not that you're difficult. It's that you don't give them the control they're used to having. You don't hand them predictable reactions. You don't shape yourself to fit their expectations. You exist just outside the patterns they rely on, and that makes you harder to navigate, harder to influence, harder to contain. And in a world where most people find comfort in control, being someone who can't be easily understood becomes something they don't know how to handle. You don't rush to fill the silence, and that alone is enough to make them uneasy. Most people are terrified of quiet. They treat it like a gap that needs to be patched, something uncomfortable that has to be covered with words, noise, reactions. But you let it sit there, you let it breathe, and in that stillness, something about you becomes harder to read, harder to grasp. They expect responses, immediate ones, familiar ones, a laugh at the right moment, a comment to keep things flowing, a reaction that reassures them everything is normal. It's how they measure connection, how they confirm control, how they keep interactions predictable. But when you don't respond the way they expect, when you pause instead of reacting, when you observe instead of participating, it throws them off balance. Your silence isn't empty, but to them, it feels like it is. They don't see the thinking behind it, the awareness, the way you take things in before deciding what deserves a response. All they see is the absence of what they're used to. And that absence makes them uncomfortable because it leaves room for uncertainty. Uncertainty is something most people avoid. It makes them question themselves. It makes them wonder what you're thinking, what you've noticed, what you've chosen not to say. And that's where the discomfort starts to grow. Because when someone can't read you, they start filling in the blanks on their own. They assume your silence means judgment. They think you're analyzing them, picking apart their words, seeing through things they'd rather keep hidden. Sometimes they believe your quietness is disapproval, even when you haven't said a single word to suggest it. It's not about what you're actually doing. It's about what your silence allows their mind to create. People are used to being understood through expression. They reveal themselves through what they say, how they react, how they engage. It's a system of constant signals, constantly exchanged and interpreted. But you don't offer those signals so easily. You hold back. You choose when to speak and when not to, and that selectiveness creates a kind of distance they don't know how to cross. That distance makes them restless. They start trying to pull something out of you. A reaction, a confirmation, anything that reassures them they can still understand you. They might talk more, push harder, ask questions they wouldn't normally ask, all in an attempt to break through the quiet. But the more they push, the more your silence stands out, and that's when it shifts. What started as curiosity becomes discomfort, and discomfort slowly turns into irritation. They begin to see your silence not as a choice, but as a problem. Something that disrupts the natural flow they rely on. Something that makes them feel exposed without knowing why. Because your silence does something they can't easily control. It forces them to sit with themselves. Without constant noise to hide behind. Without predictable reactions to lean on. They're left facing their own thoughts, their own insecurities, their own need for validation. And that's not a place most people are comfortable staying in. So instead of confronting that discomfort, they redirect it. They call you distant, cold, uninterested. They frame your silence as a flaw, something negative, something that needs to be fixed. It's easier to label you than to question why your quiet presence affects them so deeply. But the truth is, your silence isn't a weakness. It's control. It's awareness. It's the ability to choose when to engage and when to simply observe. And in a world where most people speak just to avoid feeling uncomfortable, someone who is completely at ease in silence becomes something they don't know how to handle. There are rules no one writes down, but everyone follows. You can feel them in the way people behave, in the way they adjust themselves depending on who's watching, in the way they instinctively know what's acceptable and what isn't. No one sits you down and explains these rules. You're expected to pick them up, to absorb them, to become part of the pattern without ever questioning it. Smile when it's expected. Agree when it's easier. Don't stand out too much. Don't say things that make people uncomfortable. Keep your thoughts within the boundaries of what's considered normal. It's a quiet system of control, built on subtle expectations and reinforced through approval and rejection. Most people don't even realize they're following it. They just do, because it keeps things smooth, predictable, safe. You noticed it, though. Maybe not all at once, but piece by piece. The way people changed depending on the room. The way honesty was often filtered, reshaped to avoid conflict. The way individuality was welcomed, but only up to a certain point, only as long as it didn't challenge the structure. You started to see the pattern beneath the surface, the invisible lines everyone was careful not to cross. And once you saw it, you couldn't ignore it. You stopped performing in the same way. You stopped saying things just because they were expected. You stopped pretending to agree when you didn't. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. Small moments where you chose authenticity over approval, truth over comfort. But those small moments added up, and eventually they set you apart. Because when you stop following unspoken rules, even quietly, it disrupts the balance. People might not be able to explain it, but they feel it. There's something about you that doesn't align with the flow they're used to. You don't react the way they expect. You don't adjust yourself in the same predictable ways. You exist just slightly outside the lines they've all agreed not to cross. That's when the tension starts to build. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because you're not doing what's expected. And in a system built on shared behavior, even a small deviation stands out more than you think. It makes people aware of the rules they've been following without question, and that awareness isn't comfortable, because if those rules can be broken, even by one person, then they're not as solid as they believed. And if they're not solid, then all the effort they've put into following them starts to feel uncertain. Your choices don't just affect you. They quietly challenge the structure everyone else depends on. So they react, sometimes subtly, sometimes more directly. They might question you, try to guide you back into what feels normal. They might make comments, small reminders of how things are supposed to be. Not necessarily out of malice, but out of a need to restore the balance they're used to. And when that doesn't work, when you continue to move in your own way, they start to see you differently. Not as someone simply making different choices, but as someone disrupting the system itself. They might not say it like that, but the feeling is there. You become unpredictable in a way that doesn't fit into their shared understanding of how people should behave. It's not rebellion for attention. It's not about standing out for the sake of it. It's about no longer being able to pretend that the rules make sense when they don't. It's about recognizing that fitting into something artificial comes at the cost of something real. And once you see that trade-off clearly, it becomes harder to accept it. But to them, your refusal looks like defiance. It looks like you're choosing to step outside of something they've committed to, something they've built their identities around. And that makes your presence feel like a quiet disruption, a reminder that the structure they rely on isn't as unbreakable as they thought. They don't get angry at your success the way you might expect. It's quieter than that, more subtle. It shows up in the pauses between their words, in the way their tone shifts just slightly when your name comes up, in the way they avoid looking too closely at what you've become. Because your growth isn't loud or flashy to them. It's something else, something harder to ignore. You didn't just change your circumstances. You changed yourself. And that's what makes it uncomfortable. Anyone can chase results, at least in theory. But becoming someone different, someone more disciplined, more aware, more in control of their own direction, that's a different kind of transformation. It doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen without effort. They know that, even if they don't say it. And that's where the tension begins. Because every step you've taken forward quietly reflects the steps they didn't take. Every improvement you've made, every habit you've built, every moment where you chose growth over comfort, it all stands as a silent comparison. Not one you created, but one they feel anyway. People like to believe they're doing their best, that they're making the right choices, that their current position is justified. It helps them stay comfortable, helps them avoid the weight of what they could have done differently. But when they see you, they're forced to question that belief, even if only for a moment. Because you didn't have some hidden advantage. You didn't start from a completely different place. In many ways, you were just like them, which means your progress can't be dismissed as luck or coincidence. It points to something else: effort, discipline, consistency, things they understand but haven't fully committed to. That realization isn't easy to sit with. It creates a kind of internal conflict. On one hand, they might respect what you've done. On the other, it makes them aware of their own inaction, their own hesitation, their own tendency to choose comfort over change. And instead of facing that discomfort directly, it often gets redirected. Sometimes it turns into quiet criticism. They downplay your progress, minimize your achievements, look for flaws in what you've built. Not because those flaws define you, but because finding them makes your growth feel less threatening. If they can convince themselves that your success isn't as meaningful as it looks, then they don't have to question their own choices as much. Other times it shows up as distance. They pull back, not because you've done anything wrong, but because being around you reminds them of something they're trying to avoid. Your presence becomes a kind of mirror, constantly reflecting the gap between where they are and where they could be. And that's not a reflection everyone is willing to face. The truth is, your growth didn't create their discomfort. It revealed it. It brought something to the surface that was already there, something they'd been able to ignore as long as everything around them stayed the same. But you changed. And in doing so, you disrupted that sense of sameness they relied on. It's not really about competing with you. It's about what you represent. Possibility. Change. The idea that things don't have to stay the way they are. And while that idea can be inspiring, it can also be unsettling, especially for someone who isn't ready to act on it. So instead of seeing your growth as something to learn from, something to be motivated by, they experience it as pressure, an unspoken challenge they didn't ask for, a reminder of potential they haven't used. And that pressure, left unresolved, slowly turns into something heavier, something sharper, something that feels easier to direct at you than to confront within themselves.